Nothing that requires a mood you don't have, just gentle invitations for a mood that wants to visit. Treat joy the way you'd treat a guest who comes bearing soup when you're sick. You don't have to throw a party, but open the door and let it place the bowl on your nightstand. You don't owe your suffering a 24/7 vigil. Letting in moments of light doesn't erase the gravity of what happened. It simply proves you are more spacious than the event that hurt you. And spaciousness is exactly what broken places need if they're ever to knit back together. Sometimes the barrier isn't guilt, but fear. If I let joy in, the other shoe will drop. That's trauma logic, a perfectly understandable survival strategy. But refusing joy never prevents future pain. It only bankrupts the present. The goal isn't to build joy so tall it blocks sorrow from re-entering. It's to let them coexist without either canceling the other's passport. Wholeness isn't a monologue of one emotion. It's an ensemble cast that includes every feeling, taking turns at the mic. Practically, this looks like scheduling tiny rituals of delight the way you'd schedule a physical therapy appointment. 5 minutes with your favorite comedian's podcast. A 3-line ode to the smell of rain, scribbled in your notes app. Humming along to a ridiculous 90s pop song during your commute. Each time you smile, you send biochemical proof, dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, that survival is possible. You tell your amygdala the threat isn't total. You widen the window of tolerance so the grief can flow instead of damming up and flooding everything later. This doesn't mean slapping a motivational sticker over your heartbreak. Authentic joy is never forced. It's noticed. It shows up in micro forms that are easy to miss when we're stuck in vigilant scanning for pain. The first spoonful of soup that actually tastes good after days of numbness. The way the dog's ears bounce when she runs towards you. A song on the radio that makes your foot tap before your brain can veto it. Welcoming these sparks is an act of permission, not performance. You aren't being asked to pose for a highlight reel. You're being invited to let one small candle burn so the room isn't pitch black. People who recover most fully are not the ones who stay in relentless focus on the wound, but the ones who allow their attention to oscillate, touching the sadness, then touching something that sparks warmth. That swing is not avoidance, it's self-regulation. It's the nervous system getting a sip of calm so it can keep metabolizing the heavy stuff without burning out. Think of soldiers who swap jokes in a foxhole, nurses who share memes at 3 a.m. between ICU alarms, parents who dance in the kitchen while the divorce papers sit unsigned on the table. Those flashes of levity aren't disrespect, they're oxygen. They remind the body there is still more to you than this moment. Your capacity wasn't confiscated when life turned upside down. Joy is not betrayal. When you're aching, heart cracked, confidence dented, body and spirit exhausted, moments of laughter or delight can feel almost disloyal, like you're cheating on your own grief. We instinctively police our pleasure, telling ourselves, not yet, not until the problem is fixed, not until I'm whole again. But healing isn't a courtroom where joy has to plead its case. It's more like a greenhouse, and joy is the light that coaxes new growth from damaged roots. Refusing that light doesn't prove how deeply we care. It only leaves the tender shoots fighting in the dark. Pain has gravity, and it's easy to believe that if we let ourselves rise for even a second, we'll lose the solemn wisdom of what happened. Yet every study on resilience, from trauma research to positive psychology, points to the same paradox. Because here's the truth that took me years to believe: you don't have to earn rest. You don't have to earn softness. You don't have to earn love. You just have to remember who you are underneath the pressure, beneath the proving. That person, flawed, messy, uncertain, and still trying, is already enough. So when you feel broken and your instinct is to get up and do better, pause. Ask yourself, am I trying to fix what's broken? Or am I trying to fix how I feel about being broken? And am I trying to fix how I feel about being broken? One of the hardest things I've had to unlearn is that pain isn't something I have to use to prove myself. I don't have to transform it into productivity to make it valid. I don't have to mine it for wisdom or wrap it in a bow for other people's comfort. Sometimes pain is just pain. And sometimes being in pain is all the proof we need that we deserve more, not less. Care, tenderness, support, and grace. And let's be honest, some of us have worn our suffering like a badge. We've taken pride in how much we can carry. We've measured our value by our endurance. But what if we stopped? What if we stopped confusing self-neglect for strength? What if we stopped using our suffering to justify love? That only the strong deserve kindness, that only the selfless deserve rest, that only the resilient deserve recovery. And those messages are not only false, they're cruel. They dehumanize us by turning our existence into a transaction. You are not broken because you're in pain. You are not less worthy because you're grieving, exhausted, uncertain, or undone. In fact, I believe the exact opposite. Your worth is most sacred in those moments because it's the kind that can't be dressed up or explained. It just is. You were worthy the moment you were born, not because of what you could do or prove, but because you existed. That hasn't changed. It doesn't get revoked when life knocks you down. It doesn't expire when you fall behind, lose your temper, forget how to believe in yourself. That kind of worth is unconditional. It lives beneath all the noise. It doesn't need performance. It needs. There's something deep and dangerous that many of us absorb early in life. The belief that we have to earn our worth, that we're only lovable if we achieve enough, please enough, produce enough, or endure enough. And when we feel broken, when something in our life collapses, when we're in pain or unable to show up the way we used to, that old belief comes roaring back. Now I've really lost it. Now I'm not worthy at all. Pain, instead of being seen as part of being human, becomes a kind of punishment, a sign that we're failing, a reason to try harder, perform better, stay quieter. We don't just suffer, we start to believe that our suffering defines us, that we have to make it useful or noble or productive in order to be valuable again. But that's the lie. That's the shame talking. And shame always demands that we hustle for our worth. It tells us that love must be earned through struggle. But we have to be brave enough to sit with the discomfort without trying to fix it right away. We have to stop categorizing our emotions as good or bad and instead meet each one with curiosity. What is this feeling trying to tell me? What part of me is asking to be heard, honored, or held? When you feel broken, your emotional landscape might feel like a storm, loud, unpredictable, even violent. But storms pass, and they leave behind something honest, something raw and real. Every tear, every angry thought, every moment of despair is a valid thread in the tapestry of healing. You don't have to justify your emotions. You just have to feel them. And maybe the most radical act of self-love during brokenness is not putting yourself back together right away. That we don't need to edit ourselves to stay safe. That if we let it all in, the rage, the heartbreak, the bitterness, the confusion, it won't destroy us. It will actually make us more whole. I remember a moment during a really difficult time in my life when I felt a surge of envy that surprised me. Someone else got an opportunity I had wanted deeply. And instead of feeling just disappointment, I felt this uncomfortable, bitter jealousy. Immediately the shame kicked in. You're too evolved for this. You should be happy for her. This isn't a good look. But what I realized is that in judging the envy, I was skipping over the hurt. I wasn't giving myself space to name what I had lost. And when I finally let myself feel it, all of it, I discovered something softer underneath. Grief. And then clarity. And then peace. That's what feeling fully does. It clears the path. It makes room for truth. They just bury them, push them underground where they fester, distort, and eventually show up sideways through anxiety, burnout, numbness, or disconnection. There is no healing without feeling. And yet we live in a culture that rewards emotional suppression, that applauds staying positive and looking on the bright side, even when the moment calls for grief, anger, or despair. But emotions are not wrong. They are data. They are messengers. They arrive to tell us something important. And when we shut the door on them, we miss the wisdom they carry. Allowing ourselves to feel everything, especially the feelings we judge or fear, requires an act of trust. Not in the world, and not even in other people. It's trust in ourselves. A quiet belief that we can survive the full spectrum of our emotions. One of the greatest disservices we do to ourselves when we feel broken is trying to curate our emotional experience. We try to filter, manage, and sanitize what we feel, ranking some emotions as acceptable and others as shameful. We tell ourselves things like, I shouldn't be angry, or other people have it worse, or this shouldn't hurt so much. And every time we do that, we're not just denying the feeling, we're denying ourselves the right to be human. Emotional judgment is one of the most common and quiet forms of self-abandonment. It happens in those moments when a wave of sadness or fear or resentment rises up, and instead of meeting it with curiosity, we immediately go into self-correction. We try to talk ourselves out of what's real. We say, come on, get it together. Don't be so sensitive. You're being dramatic. And those words don't make the feelings go away. That act, that visibility, isn't just a step toward healing. It is healing. You don't need to be fully rebuilt to be seen. You just need to crack the door open wide enough for the light to get in. And sometimes being seen in your brokenness is what reminds you that you're never truly broken to begin with, only unfolding. It doesn't wait for clarity or neat endings. And by delaying my visibility, by keeping people out, I only prolonged the ache. I stayed disconnected. I stayed stuck. Eventually, out of sheer exhaustion, I decided to speak. Not eloquently, not with a plan. I just told a friend, I don't feel like myself. I don't know what this is. but it's heavy. That moment, simple as it was, cracked something open, not because I was met with solutions, but because I was met with presence, with someone saying, I see you. You don't need to be anything other than what you are right now. Being seen in our uncertainty, in our brokenness, doesn't magnify the shame. It dissolves it. Because shame cannot survive empathy. And empathy cannot happen unless we're willing to be real. When we let ourselves be seen before we feel ready, we reclaim our wholeness from the grip of performance. But here's the catch. Healing doesn't happen in hiding. Growth doesn't wait for perfection. And connection, the very thing we crave in our most painful moments, requires us to be visible in our mess, not just in our triumph. The truth is, we don't need to be fully healed to be worthy of connection. We don't need to have all the answers to take up space. We don't need to sanitize our suffering before we let people in. The bravery is in showing up as we are. And more often than not, that's the very thing that creates the space for healing to begin. I remember a time in my life when I was in what I call an emotional basement. I was tired, unmotivated. Everything felt heavier than it should. But I kept telling myself, you can't talk about this yet. It's not clear enough. It's not productive enough. Wait until it makes sense. Wait until it looks wise. But pain doesn't work on our timeline. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't just come from loss or failure or heartbreak. It comes from hiding, from pretending, from shrinking into silence when what we need most is to be seen. And yet, when we feel broken, that's usually our first instinct. To disappear, to make ourselves small, to turn inward and wait until we're better, stronger, or more put together before we show ourselves again. I get it. The idea of revealing our most raw, unpolished selves feels terrifying, especially in a world that rewards image over authenticity and polish over presence. We don't want pity. We don't want to be the fragile one in the room. We want to come back when we've already healed, already grown, already transformed the wreckage into something inspirational. When I went through one of the darkest seasons of my life, there was a long stretch where I didn't feel like I was rising at all. I wasn't writing, I wasn't creating, I wasn't doing any of the things I usually associate with purpose. But I was learning how to sit still with my pain. I was learning how to speak kindly to myself in the quiet. I was learning how to stop performing worthiness and start believing in it, even when I felt at my lowest. And that fall, it didn't erase who I was. It revealed more of who I really was. It peeled away what I had outgrown. It humbled me, and it made space for new language, new boundaries, new courage. The rise didn't come all at once, but it came, and when it did, it was not a return to who I had been. It was an emergence into someone more integrated, more grounded, more whole, but an inner resilience that is forged by sitting with the truth of our lives and still choosing tenderness, still choosing to look in the mirror, still choosing to name what hurts and say, this too is part of me. The rise doesn't begin when the pain ends. The rise begins the moment we decide to stay with ourselves in the pain. The moment we choose not to abandon who we are, even when it's hard to look. It begins when we treat our lowest moment not as a source of shame, but as a sacred invitation to rebuild, not in spite of what broke us, but in conversation with it. I think of the fall as sacred ground. It's where the old stories we outgrew finally collapse. It's where we meet ourselves with nothing left to perform, nothing left to prove, and though it's painful, honestly so, it's also honest. And there's something deeply healing about honesty, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. We took a breath and asked, what is this space asking of me? Because pain has its own kind of intelligence. It strips away the performative parts of us. It reveals what's real, what's fragile, what's unfinished. It cracks open the shell of who we thought we were. And inside that crack, something softer waits. Something truer. We've all had moments when we've lost the plot, when life did not go as expected, when we felt like the structure that had held us together, our identity, our relationships, our plans, suddenly gave way. That fall can be terrifying, it's disorienting. But here's what I've learned: when we stop trying to climb out too quickly and instead allow ourselves to be in that space, honestly, fully, without shame, we discover strength we didn't know we had. Not performative strength, not grit for the sake of appearances. There's a quiet myth stitched into our cultural conversations about strength, that when you fall, the important part is how fast you get back up. That resilience means bouncing back immediately. That dignity is in the clean recovery, not the messy descent. And for a long time, I believed that too. I thought that if I could just move on quickly enough, show up with a polished smile and a well-rehearsed narrative, then the fall wouldn't matter. Or at least no one would notice it. But I've come to understand something that changed everything for me. The fall does matter. The fall is not the opposite of the rise. It's not a detour. It's part of the path. And in many ways, it is the most sacred part. We don't like to linger in our low places. We avoid them, deny them, rush past them, or try to reframe them too soon. But what if the fall itself is a space of transformation? What if, instead of rushing to stand up, pain doesn't go away because we force it to have meaning. It transforms into meaning when we give ourselves time and space to grow around it. When we ask, what can I do with what I've learned? How can I use this experience to better understand others or serve them or live more fully myself? That's when pain becomes useful. That's when it becomes a teacher instead of a jailer. But we don't get there all at once. We get there by showing up on the days when we don't know what we're doing. We get there by refusing to let despair dictate our actions. We get there by recognizing that tiny steps are not signs of weakness or slowness. They are signs of resilience. We are building a new story. And the amazing thing is that over time, those tiny choices begin to reshape not just how we move through pain, but who we become because of it. After a major failure in my own life, one that rattled my confidence in everything I believed I stood for, I kept waiting to feel inspired again. I kept waiting for a moment of clarity, of motivation, of purpose. But it didn't come. What came instead was a decision made one morning to write just a paragraph, not a chapter, not a book, just a paragraph. That one act didn't feel like much, but it was everything. It was proof that I wasn't done, that I still had something to say. And that paragraph led to another. That decision, repeated daily, quietly built its own momentum. And slowly my purpose began to emerge again, not in spite of the pain, but because I let the pain shape me without defining me. It's not enough to have a defining moment, but because I let the pain shape me without defining me. But they often leave out the middle, the in-between, the slow burn of rebuilding a life from the wreckage. What we don't talk about enough is how healing and purpose are born through repetition, through humble, consistent acts that say, I'm still here. I'm trying. I showed up. One of the most profound truths I've come to believe is that we don't need to feel strong to act with strength. We just need to take the next tiny step. Sometimes that step is getting out of bed. Sometimes it's making a phone call we've been avoiding. Sometimes it's breathing through 5 more minutes of discomfort instead of numbing out. And sometimes it's choosing to be kind to ourselves, even when our inner voice says we don't deserve it. These choices might seem insignificant, but they're not. Every small, brave act is a rebellion against hopelessness. Every time we choose presence over avoidance, connection over withdrawal, compassion over criticism, we are reclaiming agency. When we are in pain, when life has crumbled beneath us, when the story we were living no longer makes sense, there's often a voice inside that asks, what now? Sometimes it comes as a whisper, other times it roars with desperation. We want meaning. We want clarity. We want to know that the pain hasn't been for nothing. But here's the hard truth. Purpose doesn't appear out of nowhere. It doesn't arrive wrapped in certainty, delivered like a revelation, especially not when we feel shattered. Purpose is not a lightning bolt. It's a slow stitching, a gathering of small choices made in the quiet aftermath of grief, loss, rejection, or failure. It's built slowly, often invisibly, through tiny acts of courage that we repeat when we don't feel brave at all. We live in a culture that celebrates grand gestures. We love stories of radical transformation, heroic leaps, phoenixes rising from the ashes. If we fail, we lose stature and pride in a career, and those stories matter. Healing that comes from knowing we are seen and known and held. Healing that comes from realizing that even in our worst moment, we are not beyond love. That no matter how broken we feel, connection is still possible, and often it's the thing that begins to put us back together. There's no prize for suffering in silence. There's no gold star for being the most self-sufficient. What there is, instead, is a kind of quiet, life-saving grace that only appears when we dare to say, I need you. And it's not weakness to need, it's the deepest kind of strength. Because connection doesn't make our pain disappear, but it gives our pain context. It says, this pain does not make you unworthy. This darkness does not make you unlovable. And this moment is not the end of your story, but because her presence reminded me that I was still tethered to something real, something human, something life-giving. We don't need dozens of people. We need 1 or 2 who can meet us in the dark, and often they're waiting for us to let them in. They don't know how to help unless we say, this is where I am. But we don't need to have the perfect words. We don't need to give a TED Talk about our pain. Sometimes it's just a message. Hey, I'm having a hard time right now. Could we talk? Or, I don't need solutions. I just need someone to be with me for a little while. And on the other side of that courage, we often find something profound. Not just empathy, not just comfort, but healing. We convince ourselves that people will think less of us if they know what's really going on. But research and lived experience shows the opposite. Vulnerability, when shared with someone who has earned the right to hear it, creates deeper trust. It creates a bond that is stronger than perfection. Because the person who sees your wounds and still chooses to stand beside you, that's not just a friend, that's sacred. I remember a season of my life when I was completely underwater. Everything felt heavy. I wasn't writing, I wasn't sleeping, I was moving through my days like a ghost. And I kept telling myself, don't bother anyone with this. You should be able to handle it. That story nearly cost me everything. And one day, out of pure desperation, I sent a text to a friend that said 3 words, "Not doing great." That text turned into a call. That call turned into tears. Those tears turned into breath again. Not because she had a solution. Not because she had advice. Because the truth is, we do not heal alone. We were never meant to. Connection is the medicine we were made for. I've spent years researching shame and resilience, and I can say with certainty that meaningful human connection is one of the most powerful tools we have to move through pain. Not performative connection, not surface level pleasantries, but the kind of raw, real connection where we say, this is where I am, and it's messy. And the person on the other side doesn't flinch. They don't try to fix us. They simply say, me too, or I'm here, or tell me more. That moment is a lifeline. It doesn't erase what we're carrying, but it reminds us we don't have to carry it alone. Sometimes reaching out feels impossible. When we feel broken, truly broken, in the marrow of our bones, it's not just pain that takes over, it's isolation. It's the quiet lie that whispers, no one will understand. You'll burden them. They've got their own stuff. And so we withdraw. We smile when we want to cry. We say, I'm fine, even when our chest feels heavy with unshed grief. We disappear in plain sight. And slowly, that isolation compounds the pain. It turns discomfort into despair and loneliness into something toxic, shame. This instinct to pull away when we're struggling isn't weakness. It's actually rooted in protection. Our nervous systems are wired to avoid danger, and emotional exposure can feel like danger. Especially if in our past, vulnerability was met with judgment, neglect, or abandonment. But what's protective in the short term becomes destructive in the long term. And instead of saying, I failed, so I'm a failure, we begin to say, I failed at something important, but failure is part of growth, and it doesn't make me less worthy. Rewriting our narrative through self-compassion means we recognize our brokenness not as a defect, but as a doorway. The cracks in our lives let light in, not immediately, not without pain, but eventually, if we're willing to meet ourselves there. It means letting go of the version of ourselves who had to believe those lies just to survive, and embracing a version who can now choose truth over fear. That choice, moment by moment, breath by breath, is the work. It's the unglamorous, unheroic practice of being kind to ourselves when the world inside us feels dark. It's looking in the mirror and saying, you're doing the best you can, and that is enough for today. And some days, that simple sentence is more healing than any grand gesture. In my own life, I've found that when I sit with my journal after a painful experience, what shows up on the page is often brutal. You're too much. You're not smart enough. They were right about you. But if I pause, and this is key, if I stop and ask myself, what would I say to someone I love if they were feeling this? Everything shifts. I would never speak to my child, my friend, or even a stranger the way I speak to myself in moments of shame. If I had the capacity to say to myself in moments of shame, I would never speak to myself in moments of shame. If I had the capacity to say to myself in moments of shame, I would never speak to myself in moments of shame. I would say, of course you're hurting. Anyone would be. But this doesn't mean you're broken beyond repair. It just means you're human. And that's what rewriting your narrative is about. It's not about pretending the wound didn't happen. It's about telling a more honest story about what that wound means. Instead of saying, I was rejected, so I must not be lovable, we learn to say, that rejection hurt deeply, but it doesn't define my capacity to be loved or to love others. That's the lie. And that's where self-compassion becomes a revolutionary act. Self-compassion is not self-pity. It's not indulgence. It's not telling yourself everything is perfect when it's clearly not. Self-compassion is standing in the middle of your brokenness and saying, I am still worthy. I am still whole. I am still learning, growing, and healing, even now. Especially now. When we practice self-compassion, we begin to challenge the broken stories we've been repeating. We interrupt the patterns that keep us stuck. Instead of defaulting to harsh self-judgment, what Kristen Neff calls the inner critic with a megaphone, we create space for a kinder, more truthful voice to speak. Not a voice that ignores accountability, but one that offers grace. One that says, yes, that was hard. Yes, that hurt. But this is not the end of your story. When we go through something painful, something that shakes us, strips us of our identity, leaves us gasping for clarity, we don't just suffer from the event itself. We suffer from the story we begin to tell ourselves about what the pain means. These internal narratives, often formed in moments of deep vulnerability, become the lens through which we see not just the past, but also ourselves, our future, and our worth. Most of the time, these stories aren't true. They're stitched together by fear, shame, and outdated survival strategies. But because they come from inside us, we rarely question them. We don't realize they're just stories. We treat them like facts. We say things like, I always ruin things, or I'm just not someone who deserves love, or if I had been better, this wouldn't have happened. And these aren't casual thoughts. They're deep-seated beliefs built from heartbreak, loss, rejection, trauma. They feel real. They feel permanent. They feel like who we are, but we don't have to stay in that place. We don't have to live there. It's not easy. It takes courage to say, I'm feeling ashamed. Especially in a world that tells us to be confident, polished, put together. But the paradox is, we build true confidence by embracing our truth, not avoiding it. We become stronger by saying the scary things out loud, not by pretending we don't feel them. And so, if you're carrying shame about your past, your body, your family, your work, your relationship. I remember a moment when I had just given a keynote that didn't go well. I came off the stage and immediately went into a spiral. I bombed. I should have prepared more. I should have said it differently. Everyone saw it. I'm a fraud. The shame was rising so fast I could feel it in my chest. That hot, clenched, breathless feeling. My first instinct was to pretend it didn't happen, to distract myself, to scroll through my phone or disappear into work. But I caught myself. I picked up the phone and called someone I trust. And I said, I feel ashamed. I feel like I failed and that maybe I'm not good enough to do this work. And that friend didn't jump in to fix it. They didn't say, no, you were amazing. What they said was, that's so hard. I felt that too. That one sentence, that soft place to land, didn't erase the experience, but it stopped the spiral. Because in that moment, I wasn't alone anymore. It becomes proof that we are incompetent. That's what shame does. It doesn't say you made a mistake. It says you are a mistake. The antidote begins the moment we bring language to that shame. When we can say out loud, I feel ashamed, or this makes me feel like I'm not worthy, we're doing something radical. We are pulling that shame into the light. And here's the beautiful thing. Shame cannot survive empathy. The moment we speak it to someone who responds with understanding, not pity, not problem solving, just presence, we begin to take its power away. That's not a metaphor. Neuroscience backs this up. When we name an emotion, it activates the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning and self-regulation, and calms the amygdala, which is the part responsible for fear and threat. Simply naming what we feel starts to regulate our emotional response. One of the most powerful things I've ever learned through my research is this: if you can name it, you can tame it. It sounds simple, but when we're in the grip of shame, when we're drowning in that toxic mix of fear, blame, judgment, and isolation, it feels almost impossible to find the language to explain what's happening inside us. Shame thrives in silence. It grows in the dark, and it convinces us that we are alone, that we are the only ones who've ever felt this broken, this unworthy, this not enough. When we feel shame, the natural instinct is to hide. That's our nervous system doing its job, triggering fight, flight, or freeze. But when shame goes unnamed, it doesn't just stay still. It festers. It begins to define how we see ourselves. It turns one bad moment into a story about our identity. A failed relationship isn't just a painful experience. It becomes evidence that we are unlovable. A mistake at work isn't just a learning opportunity. When we feel broken, the temptation is to close off, to protect what's left, to harden. But paradoxically, the path to healing is the opposite. It's softness, it's honesty, it's reaching out, not turning inward. When we allow someone to see our mess, not our mask, they don't walk away. In fact, that's often when they lean in, because our humanity isn't in our perfection. It's in our shared experience of struggle, of rising, of starting again. So if you are hurting and you think you need to hide until you're better, I invite you to reconsider. What if the healing comes through being seen, not after? What if your courage to speak honestly about what's hard is the very thing that invites grace, belonging, and peace back into your life? Vulnerability is not weakness. It's the bravest thing we ever do. And the moment you allow yourself to be seen in your brokenness, you are no longer broken. You are healing. Healing begins the moment we choose to show up as we truly are. That's not metaphor, it's biological. Vulnerability triggers co-regulation in the nervous system. It invites empathy, which releases oxytocin, which helps us feel safe and seen. It's a chain reaction, a cascade of internal permission that says, it's okay to not be okay. And in that safety, we start to recover, not because someone fixed us. I often describe vulnerability as the willingness to be seen when we have no control over the outcome. It's telling someone, I love you first. It's applying for the job we may not get. It's sharing our art, our story, our broken pieces, even when we're not sure how they'll be received. It's not about oversharing or performing our pain. It's about choosing authenticity over armor. Vulnerability is standing in the open, without guarantee, and still choosing to speak, to try, to love. When we think about vulnerability, most of us experience a reflexive discomfort. It's the emotion we associate with exposure, uncertainty, and risk. Vulnerability is the moment before the truth leaves our lips, the pause before we admit we're struggling, the beat of silence between I'm fine and what we really mean. And yet, in all of my years researching shame, courage, and connection, one truth remains non-negotiable. Vulnerability is not a sign of weakness. It is, in fact, the most accurate measure of courage. We live in a world that glorifies strength in a very narrow sense: power, control, composure, perfection. But if we dig deeper, we find that people who appear to be holding it all together are often the most isolated, anxious, or afraid. Why? Because maintaining the performance of invulnerability is exhausting. Pretending not to feel broken doesn't make us whole. It deepens our fracture.